The phone call came at the worst possible moment. Charles was sitting at his desk at work, sorting through papers, when the screen on his phone flashed with an unknown number. His stomach tightened. Something didn't feel right. His hand hovered over the screen, then he swiped to answer. Mr. Charles. The voice on the other end was shaking, nervous. We need you to come to the school immediately. It's about your daughter, Mara. She's collapsed. We don't know what happened. Charles's heart slammed in his chest. His mind went blank. He stood up so fast his chair tipped over, but he didn't hear it hit the floor. What do you mean, collapsed? Is she okay? What happened? The voice faltered. We don't know. Please just come to the school as quickly as you can. Charles's life had been shattered 5 years ago. It had happened so suddenly, so violently, that it was impossible to forget. He still remembered the sound of Sophia's voice, laughing as she loaded the kids into the car, heading to the mall. A simple, everyday outing, nothing out of the ordinary. But that was the last time he saw his wife, Sophia, and their 2 children, Elijah and Naomi. It wasn't just an accident. No, they had been taken. Vanished. Abducted, the police said. The moment he found out, the world around him stopped, as if everything that had made sense no longer did. The first few days were the worst. Hours spent staring at walls, waiting for answers that never came. Days spent talking to police officers, making phone calls, and tracking down any clue that might lead to the children's whereabouts. But no one had seen anything. No one knew anything. And then there was Mara, his baby girl. The only thing he had left. She was just a toddler when her mother and siblings were taken, and Charles had sworn he would never let anything happen to her. He became obsessed with keeping her safe. His pain was overwhelming, and he buried himself in the task of trying to find his family, all while keeping Mara under his watchful eye. Daddy, why can't I go outside to play with the other kids? Mara would ask every time they walked past the park. She would watch the other children running and laughing, wishing she could join them. "'Cause sweetie, it's not safe. You don't understand yet, but there are bad people out there. People who might want to take you, just like they took Mommy and your brothers." For years, Mara lived in a world of isolation. She was homeschooled, her life confined to the walls of their small home. She never saw other children except for a brief glimpse from the window, and that only made her want to play even more. But Charles refused to let her go. He was terrified that the same thing that had happened to his family would happen to her. Mara, being young, couldn't understand why her father was so overprotective. She didn't understand why she couldn't play with the other kids, why she couldn't go to school like every other child. "Why don't you trust me, Daddy?" she would ask sometimes, her big brown eyes full of confusion. "I'm not going to disappear too." Finally, when Mara was 10 years old, she begged him to let her go to school. "Please, Daddy. All the other kids go and I want to go too. I don't want to be alone anymore. I want to learn with them." After days of careful thought and hesitation, Charles finally agreed. He enrolled her in a nearby school, one that was just down the street from their home. It wasn't too far. He could keep an eye on her, or at least make sure someone was always watching. He hired a trusted friend to stand at the school gate, to make sure Mara was safe, and he told the teachers to always keep an eye on her. For the first time in years, Charles allowed himself a little hope. Maybe this was the right decision. Maybe Mara would be able to grow up and experience things he could never give her, locked away in their house. The phone call Charles received that fateful day echoed in his mind as he sped to the school. His hands were shaking, his mind racing with fear. Was she okay? Was this just a freak accident? Or something far worse? He arrived at the school to find the parking lot filled with police cars and ambulances. His legs felt like jelly as he sprinted to the entrance. When he stepped inside, the principal, pale and shaken, met him in the hallway. "Mr. Charles, we're so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "Mara. She collapsed in class. We tried to resuscitate her, but..." Charles felt his world crumble around him. "What do you mean, collapsed? Is she alive? Where is she?" The principal's eyes were filled with sorrow, but she didn't answer. He followed her into the school's small nurse's office, where Mara lay on a stretcher. Her face was pale, her tiny body completely still. The room felt cold and sterile, and Charles could hardly breathe. Is she dead?" he whispered, his throat tight with panic. The nurse didn't say anything. She just looked at him with pity, shaking her head. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part came when he got the call from the hospital. "Mara's gone, Mr. Charles," the doctor said. "We did everything we could, but she didn't make it. We're sorry." He was devastated. His heart shattered into a million pieces. And yet, there was something else. Something in the back of his mind, something whispering that he hadn't lost Mara for good. A morgue. The strange movement he had heard about from an attendant there. "Mr. Charles, I know this sounds unbelievable, but Mara was moving in the morgue. We're not sure what it was, but something didn't seem right," the attendant had said. Charles couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over him after hearing the attendant's words. The idea that Mara had been moving in the morgue seemed impossible. After all, the doctors had pronounced her dead. He had seen her lifeless body himself. But something, some distant flicker of hope, told him that he needed to investigate further. After the phone call, Charles didn't know what to do. His head was spinning with confusion and fear, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let his daughter slip away without understanding what had really happened. He contacted the morgue and insisted that he be allowed to see his daughter's body again. The staff was hesitant at first, but after a few hours of convincing, they relented. Charles arrived at the morgue, heart pounding, hoping that what he was about to see wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. The attendant, a young man with a sympathetic look in his eyes, led Charles to the cold storage room. It was here, the attendant explained, that he had noticed Mara moving. Charles's pulse raced as he approached the steel table where his daughter's body lay, covered in a white sheet. She was still and cold, the way he had last seen her. For a moment, he almost convinced himself that the attendant had been mistaken. After all, it was impossible for a dead body to move. But then he noticed something. There, just beneath the sheet, was a slight movement. It was almost imperceptible at first. A twitch, a shift. His heart jumped into his throat. Is she breathing?" Charles whispered to the attendant, who was equally stunned. "No. There's no way," the attendant murmured, shaking his head. Charles could hardly believe his eyes. He leaned in closer, his hands trembling as he lifted the corner of the sheet just a little. His breath caught in his chest as he saw it, a subtle but unmistakable rise and fall of her chest. "She's alive," Charles whispered, his voice breaking. He quickly called the hospital. His hands were shaking as he spoke with the doctor, demanding that they bring Mara back to the hospital for further tests. "I need you to bring her back here now," he shouted, the panic rising in his voice. "Something is wrong. I believe she's still alive." The doctor hesitated, but Charles wasn't going to back down. It was his daughter's life on the line, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He had to be sure. The phone call was followed by frantic steps to have Mara transferred back to the hospital. As soon as they arrived at the hospital, Charles met the medical team in a state of barely contained panic. His voice shook as he tried to explain everything. How he had seen his daughter move in the morgue, how he believed she had been alive all along. The doctors, though skeptical at first, quickly went to work. They hooked Mara up to monitors, checked her vitals, and did everything they could to stabilize her. It felt like an eternity before they finally spoke to Charles again. "Mr. Charles," the lead doctor said, his face grim. "It's true. Your daughter was not dead. She was under a very strong sedative, one that mimics death. It's an extremely rare drug, and in high doses, it can make the body appear lifeless for an extended period of time." "How is that even possible?" Charles asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would anyone do this to my daughter? Why wasn't I told?" The doctor sighed, looking down at the floor. "This kind of thing doesn't just happen. Someone had to have given her the drug. We don't know who, but the dosage was high enough that it could have caused permanent damage if we hadn't acted quickly. This wasn't an accident. Someone had planned this. Someone had done this on purpose. The days that followed were a blur. Charles sat by Mara's side as she slowly regained consciousness, her eyes fluttering open after what felt like an eternity. She was weak, disoriented, and confused, but at least she was alive. As her condition improved, Charles spent every waking moment trying to piece together what had happened. He couldn't rest until he had answers. He needed to know who had done this, who had hurt his daughter in such a cruel and calculated way. He spent days by her side, watching her slowly recover. Mara had no memory of what had happened, no recollection of the time she had spent in that dark, drugged state. She was confused, asking him questions that broke his heart, like why she couldn't remember the days at school or why she had been in the hospital for so long. "Daddy," Mara said one night, her voice soft and tentative, "I don't remember anything after I went to school. I don't even remember what happened to me. Was I dreaming?" Charles could barely hold back his tears. "No, sweetheart. You weren't dreaming. You were very sick, but you're okay now. You're going to be all right." But as the days passed, the questions continued to haunt him. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. One night, after the hospital had quieted down and the staff had finished their rounds, Charles did something he never thought he would do. He returned to the morgue. It was late, and the hallways were dimly lit, casting long shadows that made his stomach turn. The idea of stepping back into that cold, sterile room where his daughter had been, or rather appeared to be, dead, sent a chill down his spine. He approached the desk and asked the attendant if he could look at the surveillance footage from the night of Mara's death. At first, the attendant seemed reluctant, but after some convincing, and the promise that he would keep it discreet, Charles was allowed to watch the video. The footage was grainy, but it showed something that made Charles freeze in his tracks. The video was taken from a camera that overlooked the morgue's preparation room. The timestamp on the video read late at night, hours after Mara had been brought in. Charles's eyes widened as he saw a shadow move in the corner of the frame. It was subtle at first, but then it became unmistakable. Mara's body, lying under the sheet, shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't the normal movements that would come with rigor mortis. No. This was deliberate. Her fingers twitched, and her chest rose and fell, just enough to suggest that she was still alive. He called the hospital immediately, demanding answers. The hospital launched an internal investigation to figure out what had happened to Mara. They started by questioning the staff who had been involved in her care. It was when the investigators spoke to one of the hospital nurses that Charles's suspicion grew. The nurse, a woman named Abigail, had been working at the hospital for years. She had been a kind and helpful presence during Mara's stay, and Charles never thought twice about her. But as the investigators dug deeper, they discovered something unsettling. Abigail had been the one who had administered the drug to Mara, the very drug that had kept her in that coma-like state. The more the police looked into Abigail's past, the more they uncovered. They found that Abigail had recently become involved with a new school that was just down the street from the hospital. It was a small, local school, one where Charles had eventually enrolled Mara. That connection alone made Charles's stomach churn. It turned out that Abigail had once been a part of Charles's life, years before the abduction of his wife and children. She had been a colleague at the hospital, and she had always harbored feelings for him. But Charles, being the loving husband he was, had never reciprocated her feelings. He had been too focused on Sophia, the love of his life, and Abigail had never been able to let go of the pain of rejection. She had tried to win him over, but he had never looked her way. And when he fell in love with Sophia, Abigail's jealousy reached a boiling point. Abigail's jealousy had driven her to take desperate, drastic measures. She had orchestrated the abduction of Sophia, Elijah, and Naomi, making it look like they had disappeared without a trace. She wanted to destroy Charles's happiness, to make him feel the same emptiness she had felt all those years. She had taken everything from him, and now, with Mara, She had almost succeeded in finishing what she had started. Charles couldn't breathe. His world, which had already been shattered once, now felt like it was on the brink of collapse. The truth was worse than he had imagined. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with horrifying clarity, and all the questions he had about the last 5 years suddenly made sense. The abduction, the silence, the heartbreak, it had all been Abigail's doing. Charles didn't know how to move forward. His heart was heavy with the weight of what he had learned. His family, his life had been torn apart by this woman. He wanted justice, but he also wanted peace. He wanted the past to be buried, to move on from the nightmare that had haunted him for so long. But he knew that was impossible. Abigail had to be stopped, and she needed to pay for what she had done. Days passed in a blur as the investigation continued. The police had already arrested Abigail, and she was being questioned about the abduction of Sophia and the children. The authorities were piecing together her twisted web of lies, and Charles couldn't stop thinking about what would come next. He spent hours at the police station talking to detectives, answering their questions and reviewing the evidence. The more he learned about Abigail's past, the more horrifying it became. She had planned everything meticulously, from the drugging of Mara to the abduction of his family. She had been watching him for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now she was finally going to pay. But Charles's focus wasn't just on Abigail anymore. No, it was on his family. His long-lost wife and children. The ones who had been taken from him all those years ago. The ones he had believed were gone forever. The police had uncovered the truth. Abigail had kept them hidden for so long, but now they had finally found them. After years of searching, Charles's missing family was alive. His wife Sophia and their 2 children Elijah and Naomi had been kept in a small, secluded location, a dark and dingy room in a run-down building on the outskirts of the city. They had been malnourished, neglected, and kept out of sight, but they had survived. They had been kept alive by Abigail's twisted mind, and now they were free. Charles was told to prepare himself. The moment he had been waiting for was finally here. He would be reunited with his family. Felt like a dream. The drive to the location where his family had been kept felt like an eternity. Charles's heart was racing. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He had waited so long for this moment, but the fear of what he would find gnawed at him. What if they were too broken to recognize him? What if they couldn't remember who he was? What if, after all these years, they had forgotten their father? When they arrived at the building, Charles was escorted into the small, dark room where his family had been held. The air inside was thick, musty, and cold. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was frozen in place, a horrifying reminder of the years they had spent locked away. And then he saw them. Sophia, his beautiful wife, was sitting on a makeshift bed, her face gaunt and pale. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Her lips trembled as she whispered his name. Charles. Charles felt his heart stop in his chest. He hadn't seen her in 5 years. She looked so different, so fragile. But there was no mistaking it. It was her. His love. His wife. He dropped to his knees in front of her, tears streaming down his face. Sophia. It's really you. Sophia reached out a trembling hand, touching his face, as if she couldn't believe he was real. I thought you had forgotten about us, she whispered. Her voice cracked with emotion. I never gave up on you, Charles replied. His voice choked with emotion. I never stopped looking. I never stopped loving you. They embraced, holding each other tightly as if afraid they might disappear again. The years of pain, of searching, of longing, all of it melted away in that moment. But there was still more to be done. The children. Charles turned to the corner of the room where Elijah and Naomi were sitting, looking at him with wide, fearful eyes. They were both older now, their faces reflecting the trauma they had endured. Elijah, the older of the 2, stood up first, his legs shaky, and walked over to Charles. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were full of questions. Charles crouched down to meet him, opening his arms. "Elijah." "It's me. It's your dad." Elijah hesitated for a moment, but then, as if sensing the truth, he rushed into Charles's arms, his small body trembling with emotion. "Daddy," Elijah whispered, his voice breaking. Charles held him close, tears falling freely now. He didn't care who saw. His children were alive. They were home. Naomi, too, walked over slowly, her eyes still full of fear but softened by the recognition in her father's eyes. Charles opened his arms to her, and she, too, rushed into his embrace. "I've missed you so much," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've all been so strong." As they stood there, the family reunited, Charles could barely believe it. All these years, he had thought they were gone forever. And now they were back. They were alive. The news of Abigail's arrest spread quickly. The police had gathered all the evidence they needed to prove her guilt. Her confession, the surveillance footage, and the testimonies from the hospital staff, including the nurse who had administered the drug to Mara. Her twisted plan had been unraveled, and now it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. Charles was grateful for the justice, but it wasn't enough to heal the scars Abigail had left behind. Nothing would ever bring back the lost years, the time stolen from his family, the pain of not knowing if his wife and children were alive or dead. But now, with his family back together, Charles finally felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. Abigail was taken into custody and charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping, attempted murder, and child endangerment. The court proceedings were long and painful, but Charles attended every hearing, his resolve unwavering. It wasn't just for Mara or for himself. It was for Sophia, Elijah, and Naomi. For the years they had lost and for the future they now had a chance to rebuild. As the trial progressed, Abigail's past came to light. Her obsession with Charles, her twisted jealousy, and her descent into madness. It became clear that she had never been able to move on from her unrequited feelings for Charles, and her hatred for his happiness had consumed her. She had sabotaged his life, and in doing so, she had destroyed her own. The day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed with people, and the air was thick with tension. Charles sat at the front, his hand firmly gripping Mara's small hand, while Sophia, Elijah, and Naomi sat beside him. He could feel their support, their presence giving him the strength he needed to face the final chapter of this nightmare. When the judge read the verdict, Abigail's fate was sealed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The relief that washed over Charles in that moment was overwhelming. Justice had been served, and Abigail's reign of terror was over. With Abigail behind bars, the family could finally begin the long process of healing. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the memories of the past haunted them, when the pain of what had been lost resurfaced, threatening to undo the fragile peace they had fought so hard to reclaim. But with each passing day they grew stronger. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from the love they shared, and slowly, they began to rebuild their lives. Charles and Sophia worked together to help Elijah and Naomi recover from the trauma they had endured. They sought therapy, took long walks together, and found ways to celebrate the little moments of joy, moments that had been stolen from them for so long. Elijah and Naomi had grown up in a world of fear and uncertainty, but they were home now, and that was all that mattered. Mara, too, struggled with the memories of her time in the hospital. The drug that had kept her in a near-death state had left its mark on her, and she often had nightmares. But with her father's love and support, she found the strength to face each new day. Slowly, she regained her confidence and began to live the life she had been denied for so long. Her eyes sparkled with hope once more, and Charles knew that this was only the beginning of her healing journey. Life outside the shadows of Abigail's cruelty began to feel different. The simple things that Charles had once taken for granted now felt like blessings. Family dinners, walks in the park, the sound of laughter echoing through the house. It was like they had been given a second chance, and they weren't going to waste it. Charles returned to work, but it was different now. He wasn't consumed by grief or fear. He wasn't chasing shadows or running from his past. He had his family, and that was enough. His heart had been broken, but now it was mending piece by piece, day by day. Sophia found solace in her art again. She had been an artist before the abduction, but the years spent in captivity had taken away her joy. Slowly, she started painting again, letting her creativity flow as she worked to rebuild her life. She had missed so much, but now she had a future to look forward to, a future filled with hope and love. Elijah and Naomi, though still adjusting to their new reality, began to flourish. They were in school again, making new friends, learning to trust again. It wasn't easy, but they were resilient. They were survivors. And every day they grew stronger. Mara, who had once been so isolated, now blossomed in her newfound freedom. She started to make friends at school, playing outside and laughing with the other children. Charles watched with pride as his daughter's once shy smile returned, a reflection of the hope that had been restored to their lives. One evening after dinner, the family gathered on the couch, surrounded by the warmth of their home. Charles looked around at the faces of the people he loved most in the world: Sophia, Elijah, Naomi, and Mara. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. They had made it through the worst storm of their lives, and now they were together again, stronger than ever. "This is what matters," Charles said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We have each other. That's all that matters." Sophia rested her head on his shoulder, her hand gently holding his. "We're home," she whispered. "We're finally home." Charles smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. For the first time in years he felt peace. He had lost so much, but he had gained so much more. His family was together again, and nothing could ever take that away. As they sat together, watching the sunset through the window, Charles knew that the past would always be a part of them. The pain, the fear, and the heartbreak would never fully go away. But they survived. They had fought for each other, and they had won. They had rebuilt their lives from the ashes of their past, and now the future was theirs to shape. They were stronger than they had ever been. They were a family, whole again, and nothing, not even Abigail's cruelty, could ever take that away from them. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments. Do not forget to tell me where you are watching from. This week's special shout-out goes to Daniela and Toby in Nigeria.